1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi everybody, I'm Steve, and this is a talk called Development and Philosophy. So first thing out of the way, I also work at Jumpstart Lab, just like you saw Jeff yesterday. Every time we both speak at the same conference, I make this really lame joke about like, welcome to Jumpstart Lab Conf. We came really far away to have all these speakers here. But we also, so Jeff talked a lot about our big team training programs, but we also do like 2-day to 2-week trainings at companies. So if any of you want to get better at Ruby or Rails, you should give us a call, and we would love to come down here and run a smaller one, even if you don't want to build 24 developers from scratch. So that's what we do all the day, is teach Rails and Ruby. The other thing I want to say real quick is that this has been a really great conference, and thank you so much for having me here. I've really enjoyed being here. This is my first time in South America. I've also really enjoyed all the talks so far. Specifically, I really loved Santiago's talk, and that's because I also recently gave a talk about why you should care about Rails 4, but his was so much more even-handed than mine was. Like, I really got into it, so I want to share with you 2 slides from my version of the talk. Here's one, and then here's the other. So I thought he did a really good job of presenting all these features in a neutral way, even if I didn't. So it's been great. Okay, so one other small disclaimer about this talk. Most of the text on my slides has been sourced from Wikipedia, and this is not because I think that Wikipedia is the best resource on this kind of thing, but I'm going to cover a lot of ground and talk about some really big picture topics, and we tend to investigate new topics by looking at Wikipedia first, so I wanted to make it the same words you would be likely to read later so that you can draw those connections. So in some parts, these may gloss over some details and be slightly inaccurate because that's the way Wikipedia is, right? But we love it anyway, so I just wanted to mention that real quick. Okay, so talking about philosophy. The first thing that's sort of weird about giving a talk about philosophy at a programming conference is that it's in the humanities, not the sciences, right? So I was talking to some guys up there a minute ago, and like, oh, what are you talking about? And I was like, philosophy? And they, what? Gave me a funny look. But I think that it's really important that we as programmers study the humanities, and that's because ultimately everything that we do, right, is built for humans. And I think that one of the faults, at least that I've come to realize in my life up until this point, is that I focused way too much on what computers do and not enough about what people do, right? Ultimately, we are building technology and we love technology, but people will use it. And so we need to take into account how people will use it and the way that they use it and keep the people focus in mind. Google actually said last year that their next 10,000 hires or something ridiculous were going to be people with humanities PhDs rather than people with sciences PhDs. And because they've been often accused of, forgetting the human part about computers. So I think that that's one reason to study philosophy is very important. And just in general, even if it's not philosophy specifically, I think that it's really important for us to become more interdisciplinary. It's sort of silly to me that we focus so much on just programming and we don't know a lot about other topics. So if you talk to someone that's a philosophy PhD, for example, they know so much more about history than I will ever know, and they generally speak multiple languages, which a lot of you do, but I don't because I'm a dumb American and we don't have to. I'm constantly like, oh man. I took 3 years of Spanish in high school and I don't understand like any of it now, which I really regret, but oh well. I also work on my Japanese every once in a while, and I always tell people like, I just can't find a way to keep up with it. And they're like, you're a Ruby programmer and you can't find a way to learn Japanese? Like, come on, there's mailing lists and stuff, but it's hard. But ultimately, like working in an interdisciplinary way means that we get to have different perspectives, and I think that that's really useful, right? I recently moved to Los Angeles, and everyone asked me why I didn't move to San Francisco instead, and the answer was because I did not want to be in the echo chamber of Silicon Valley, because that gets you into this narrow mindset that I didn't really want to necessarily be a part of. So I think it's really important that we study things that are not computer science. So even if it's not philosophy, I would encourage you to investigate something else that's totally unrelated to computers, because it'll give you a new perspective about everything. And this is really hard because other disciplines use DSLs. So like, we as Rubyists love the DSL technique for writing different kinds of programs, right? But it's often that other disciplines use terms that we're familiar with in a totally different way because in their domain, it has a specific different language. So that can be really confusing at times and has been hard for me when investigating the humanities. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And ultimately, all of this stuff is really hard, but also really, really rewarding. So The last 10 books that I've read have not been technical books. Well, maybe one of them was, but the rest of them have all been not technical, and I think that it's really worthwhile. The one that I'm currently reading is actually the 4th time I have tried to read this book and failed, and was recently asked, like, do you think that it's still worth it? And I was like, yeah, totally, because every time I come closer and it's different perspectives and all that stuff. So this can be really difficult to get out of your comfort zone. And ultimately, like, monoculture is death, right? So like if we are all identical, then when our weakness comes around, then we will fail. So we need to have diversity as a cultural strength. Whenever everybody follows the same path too strongly, that's when bad stuff can happen. Okay, so philosophy now. Some humanities backgrounds. Now let's actually get into the meat of this stuff. I know you're all really familiar with the Greek, so I'll put the Greek up here instead. That's philosophia, right? And it stands for the love of wisdom. So this is like the original definition for what philosophy means. And I really happen to like this definition a lot. I find it to be very romantic. It's like a nice like phrase, but it's also a little generic. So there's another like more sciencey variant that I found called philosophy is the study of general and fundamental problems. So I think this makes it a little more clear sometimes too. So it's very broad, right, and very vague, which is sort of what this field can be about sometimes. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down the field into the 5 major parts. Like there's 5 major kinds of philosophy. And we'll talk a little bit about 4 of them, and then I'm going to go deep dive into one of them and then show you why, as a programmer, that kind of philosophy is really relevant to you. And I'm sort of going to punt on that why until the end. So I'll do little teeny bits of why in the middle, but like don't expect a really great answer about why until we get the whole way to the end. So the first subfield of philosophy is called aesthetics. I picked this one to start with, first of all, because it starts with an A, and A's are at the beginning, but also because it's really not hard to sell Rubyists on why aesthetics are important and how aesthetics are relevant to programming, right? So a good definition of aesthetics is the nature of beauty, art, and taste with the creation and appreciation of beauty. And so this is a pretty reasonable definition, and I think it's one that you might agree with if you think about like the word aesthetics, but it leaves out a critical word, so I actually also like this definition, which is critical reflection on art, culture, and nature. So ultimately, if you want to discuss aesthetics, right, like it's not that like all art is beautiful, right? So like the aesthetics of art, you need to be critical about the way in which it is beautiful. It's a reflection on what aspects make it so or not so. So like this is why we use Ruby and why we use Rails, right? Like at least for me, I fell in love with Ruby because it's beautiful, and I think that there's an advantage to those aesthetics, right? Talk about how Ruby fits our minds better, and it reflects the way that we write things, right? I've actually stopped writing Sinatra apps because every time I use Sinatra, I slowly rebuild Rails because the Rails aesthetic appeals to me so much that I end up re-implementing it anyway. So that's aesthetics and how it matters to us. Logic. This is the second one I picked because we're so familiar with this particular branch. If you have a degree in computer science, then you did an endless amount of logic studies in college. And to more formally define it, logic is the study or modes of reasoning and the use of valid reasoning, right? The thing that I always think about when I think about logic is a maxim that I have personally, which is programmers are hypocrites, including me. So we're so obsessed with this idea of logic and like logical fallacies that we memorize all of these like sound bites and then throw them at each other on Twitter, right? So I feel like in order to be on Twitter, you have to like memorize tons of fallacies and be like, oh, well, obviously, that's not following solid design principles, right? And they like dodge that and they fire back with like, well, convention over configuration. And then the meantime, we're all violating all those principles when we're writing code, because usually we're like talking on Twitter instead of working. So instead of writing good code at my desk, I'm busy telling other people how they should be writing good code while writing bad code myself. So I always try to keep that in mind because it's really hard to like write good code. But so that's logic, and it's pretty obvious how logic is relevant to us. This is a fun word to pull out at parties, epistemology. It's way more complicated sounding than it actually is. And basically, epistemology is the part of philosophy that's concerned with the nature and scope of knowledge, which sounds kind of Yeah, like this is like what is true, what can we understand, what is knowable, what is not knowable. So when I think about this in a computer science context, I definitely think about things like the halting problem, for example. It's impossible to know if a program will terminate or not. So that has sort of an epistemologic bent. But there's another cool thought experiment in determinism called Laplace's demon that I think is sort of relevant. This is one that I'm currently thinking about, so this is sort of a small little ramble. I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. Basically, Laplace's demon is a thought experiment. If you knew the particle of the place of every particle in the universe, and you knew all the rules of physics, would you be able to think about or know the position of all of the particles in the world at the next second, like 1 second later, right? So if the world is deterministic, then yes, and if it's not deterministic, then no. Software and computers are generally deterministic. So if the world is not deterministic and computers are deterministic, is it possible to model the real world in computers, right? Like we try to model the real world, but is that fundamentally impossible? And so is that maybe where bugs come from? Because it's not actually possible to truly model the world? I don't know, and that might just be crazy rambling. But that's the kind of things that epistemology is useful for, I guess, like things that we can know and how they apply to the world. Then there's metaphysics. Nerds love meta, right? Everything meta. So it's sort of like the physics of physics in a way is how I remember this one. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that's concerned with explaining the fundamental nature of being in the world. And there's a bunch of different sub-disciplines. This is sort of often the most fundamental, like when you think about philosophy, this is sort of probably what you're thinking of, is something that happens in metaphysics. When I gave this talk at Eurocamp, the only negative feedback was this person who was like, yeah, your talk was pretty good, but no, seriously, fuck metaphysics. I hate it. So people get really passionate about this stuff. How it relates to programming is there's specifically a subfield of metaphysics called ontology. If you've ever done any natural language processing, you've probably seen this word before. It's sort of like, in the context of that, it's like a giant list of words, like all of the different things and their relations. And that's sort of, in a more general sense, what the idea of ontology is. It's a way of categorizing and putting into, say, a hierarchy, or maybe not a hierarchy, what all of the stuff is and how that stuff relates to the other stuff that is, which is a really generic sounding sentence. But in programming, I always think about this as object-oriented design, right? So to me, the arguments between Avdi Grimm and David Hannemeyer Hansen are fundamentally questions of ontology and which ontology is appropriate, right? Do we have a ton of small objects that all work together, or do we have bigger, more massive objects that work with each other? Another really interesting wrench in this works is that there is a branch of philosophy that's come around in the last 10 years called object-oriented ontology, and they use all of our terms, but they're not talking about programming ontology or object-oriented stuff whatsoever. But they use all of our language. I went to see one of the founding guys in it speak at Carnegie Mellon University a while back, and I literally had I listened to this guy talk for an hour and a half, and I did not understand a single word that he said. So that was fun, but all the words that were coming out of his mouth were familiar. So it was a really weird experience. So anyway, all right, so those are the first four. So now we'll dig into the last one, which if you follow me on Twitter, you're not really going to be surprised by my choice of digging into this one. But that's political philosophy and ethics. Fundamentally, ethics is about systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior and what that even means. And political philosophy is providing insight into various aspects of the origin of the state, its institutions and laws, all that stuff. So these two things are tied together in a really big way. How we're going to talk about this and how it applies to programmers is I'm going to take what appears to be like a giant diversion and then go through this big, long line of history and thinkers, and then we're going to end up at programming out of the middle of nowhere. So get ready. So structuralism. Structuralism is this particular kind of linguistics that was invented by this guy, Ferdinand de Saussure. I've been joking that that's the American way of saying it is saucer. I'm pretty sure it's Saussure or something like that, but I can't say French words, and every time you say something, yeah, I got it pretty close. Every time I try to say French, I feel like I'm still being judged, even if I do get it right. So I don't know. But he was a linguist, and he had a particular model for how language worked. And it is based around this idea called structuralism. So structuralism sought to clarify systems of signs through analyzing the discourses they limit and make possible. This is kind of a crazy sentence. Already, again, you're seeing this like jargon from other fields, right? So signs, discourses, all these kinds of things. Basically, what it boils down to is that he thought that language modeled how we think. And so there's this field called semiotics, in which you have, all kinds of thought can be represented with this idea of the sign, the signified, and the signifier. This picture is a little small, so I apologize if the text is small for anybody that's in the back. But so basically, a sign would be like the word open hung above a shop door, which is kind of bad because that's also a sign. I should have picked a better example for this, but I didn't. And so the signifier is the word open itself, and the signified concept is that the shop is open for business. So when you combine the physical word open with the idea it represents, you get this thing called a sign. And then he thought that all language is built out of building these ideas and the way that they related to one another. So when we talk about ideas and their relationships, it was through these signifying chains of signs. So what's crazy about this, and this is another random brief detour, so REST, when I saw this thing, I was like, okay, so we have a resource that consists of an entity and a representation of that entity, and you put those two things together and you get a resource. I don't really know if this has any relevance. It's just one of those things, your brain sometimes makes a weird connection, and so it's like the same thing, but in a totally different area. So I don't know how this is useful, but whatever, I thought I would bring it up anyway. What's interesting about structuralism is that as a method of dealing with language, this actually came under attack in the 70s by Noam Chomsky, who you should know about because of Chomsky grammar, right? So when we do compilers, you're talking about whether languages can have certain power in representing ideas. That comes from Chomsky, whose grammar was actually about linguistics, but we use it in computer science because programs are languages. And so Chomsky's linguistics was a direct attack upon structuralism and Levi Strauss. So there's like one weird computer science to this connection made. But so even if, disregarding the whole question of whether Chomsky or Saussure is right about the idea of linguistics, this model of thinking is still interesting and can be applied to other fields anyway. So this guy, Claude Levi-Strauss, again, to whatever, I'm going to butcher his name, it happens. He was applying these ideas to sociology, actually, shortly later. And if the same ideas could be dealt with when thinking about the way that social things work. So working on the work of Levi Strauss, there's this dude, Michel Foucault, who wrote this book called Discipline and Punish. And this book is really, really awesome, mostly because I simultaneously did really well in school and hated it. So this book starts off really random. I was told to read this book, and I got like halfway through it, and I was like, the entirety of this book so far has been explaining medieval torture techniques. Like it's like, if a guy does this thing wrong, then you need to like hold this, if he kills someone with a sword, you hold onto the sword and you make him hold it up and then you dump acid onto it so his hand and the sword melt together. And it's just like really grotesque, elaborate explanations of how you torture people. And my mentor was like, no, keep reading, it'll make sense eventually. So you get to towards the middle of the book, and finally he starts talking about, so originally society was based around this whole feudalism concept, right? We had kings and lords and all that. So a king's power is from this idea called divine right? Like a king is literally someone who is God incarnate on the world. And so the idea of torturing people was that if you harmed someone else in the world, since the world was part of the body of the sovereign, then you needed to have punishment enacted upon your body in the same way that you did punishment to them. So it was like, an eye for an eye style justice. And the problem with torture, though, was the Streisand effect, is what we call this now. So basically, when you torture people, you have this really spectacular venue to criticize how horrific torturing people is. And so we had to stop torturing people, theoretically, to keep, social stuff going. And we moved, past this idea of like physical punishment. And he talks about this thing called the panopticon, which is a way of spying on each other, and it's modeled the same way my dorms were in college, which is really funny, but that's like too far off. I need to get back on topic a little bit. So So this discipline, I guess I should say so the model after like feudalism basically was based on discipline. So the idea of a disciplined society is that we regulate the way that people do things without like the necessarily threat of bodily harm, but we're obsessed with this idea of like what their bodies actually do. So if you ever studied like Ford and Taylorism and how assembly lines worked, they would literally study how people would move stuff off of assembly lines onto other assembly lines so that they could make it more efficient and like squeeze every single last bit of efficiency out of their workers. And that was disciplined society. 5 minutes? Cool. So then there's this dude, Deleuze and Guattari, who wrote this book called Thousand Plateaus that talked about how we actually didn't even need to physically regulate people's bodies anymore. We could just regulate their minds. And then after that, that was very short-lived because these guys died right before the internet showed up. And this guy, Alexander Galloway, wrote a book called Protocol that builds off of all those previous ideas that talks about social control in the internet and how the internet is used directly to control people. So the idea basically is this thing of control versus protocol. So I like to think of this as Microsoft versus Google, basically, right? So Microsoft was very clearly the enemy. I gave this talk in front of a non-Ruby crowd once, and like half the people were .NET developers, and I got to the slide, and I was like, oh, I forgot I'm saying that, but whatever, and just said it anyway. But you know, if you were around in the late 90s, like Microsoft was very clearly the enemy of all that was good and open and holy about programming, right? But now we have Google, who is also pretty clearly the enemy of all that is good and holy and wonderful about programming, but we all love Google. So what's the difference? Control gives us a very clear enemy, right? So like Microsoft was doing a whole bunch of really evil stuff that was directly manipulating, you know, going against the standards process, right? And like abandoning Internet Explorer and having it not follow web standards is one like very clear example of them doing stuff. But the funny thing about protocol and the way that protocol controls us is that it pretends to be our friend while actually being our enemy. Protocol knows how to use the standards process against us instead of violating the standards process. So for example, Speedy, I'm on the working group for HTTP 2.0, and there's a ton of people who just want to like rubber stamp Speedy as like the next version of HTTP. And I am very concerned that we're letting an advertising company fundamentally rewrite the way that every computer in the world talks to each other without questioning it at all. It seems very strange to me. There's also lots of good technical reasons why Speedy is sort of awkward, but the point is that people love Google so much that they're willing to overlook and not be critical of those technical flaws because they give us like 3 gigabytes of free email now or something, right? Like. And Google Hangouts with those like things on your face, it's awesome. This is also like the I would quit Facebook, but all my friends are on it argument, right? Like there's no law that says you must be on Facebook, but if all of your friends are on Facebook, then you basically have to be on Facebook. And so that's like a way of socially controlling people without like directly, right? There's nobody coming to your house and saying you need to have Facebook. The last example of this, and this is like the most current example of how this pertains to us as programmers, is like RSS, right? So like we had RSS for a long time, and it was really awesome. And some people still use RSS, as Win pointed out. But like now we hate RSS, and we use these things like app.net, for example. So what's funny about RSS is that it's totally open and not controlled by anyone, right? It's free for everyone to use. App.net has this mantra that like you're the customer, not the product, which is like, you know, a nice thing, right? Like startups get bought out. We don't want to do that sort of stuff. We don't want you to abandon everyone, you know, whenever you get your payday and everything folds up. But if you look into it actually, so like Mixed Media Labs runs app.net, and they had this product called Pick Please, and it received $5 million in venture funding. But then, you know, so it's like, then they shut that down in order to do app.net. So the people who are saying like you're the customer, not the product, have already thrown away one whole batch of customers to go on to something else, even when they were making money doing it. So like that's a very obvious manipulation of, you know, all of us. And I bet when you gave them your $50, you didn't know that they had $5 million in venture funding and they didn't actually need your money to build it, right? So that kind of deception is why I've been running around telling everybody that app.net is stupid. Yeah, I'm wrapping up totally as the last slide. So anyway, I want to tell you that this stuff is all you know, very deep topics. So you know, I encourage you to dive into it, even though it's hard. And thanks a lot for listening to me. It's my Twitter handle.
Bueno, ¿preguntas?
Hi, Steve.
Hey.
I'm a philosophy student, and for a long time I had to hide my academic background because it was I used to do philosophy. You're a freak. Why are you programming? My question is very simply: what book do you think was most influential for you as a developer?
So for me, it was definitely the Protocol book by Galloway that I referenced. I'll tweet a link to it with the RubyConf AR hashtag or whatever. But that was because it was the one that was like most directly relevant. Like they use computer science terms. Like he has like the HTTP spec quoted in it and stuff like that. And so that was the one that I found most important, at least in the short term. And it was the entry point. So I sort of read that book and I was like, why is he saying that? Now I have to study this guy, and now I have to study this guy, and then this guy. So that would be what I would say. For sure.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
¿Más?
So, I quit Facebook.
Sweet. So did I.
Yeah.
High five.
And I'm trying not to enter Google Plus.
Yeah.
But what the fuck are the alternatives?
Yeah, I know. So literally, I also deleted my Google Plus, but then Aaron Patterson wanted to hang out, and so I pretty much signed up for Google Plus because
I
if
needed
Aaron
to
wants to
create
hang
it
out with you,
just
then you
for the
hang out.
Hangouts.
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, we can try to create and encourage truly open projects. So, for example, I have built a totally open source federated alternative to Twitter called RStatus, and all the Rubyists told me they would sign up for it and use it, and then none of them did, and they all went on Twitter anyway. So. So that's really like the only alternative is that I can see, at least in the short term, is to try to convince people to use open things as much as possible, and more importantly, be able to think critically about this stuff and actually examine whether it's a good idea or not. So and that's the only way that you can determine if something is truly good and open and see what people are actually saying. So.
I don't know if you were yesterday on the talk Bruno did about the distributed and peer-to-peer connections between browsers, and he was mentioning that there could be a possibility of doing some kind of really peer-to-peer social app.
Right.
Do you see any possibilities of that?
So there's already a federated protocol called OStatus, and that's what RStatus and Identica and StatusNet and Diaspora all implement. So it's not peer-to-peer, it's federated, but I actually think that federated is superior to peer-to-peer in many cases. So it already exists, just people don't use it because they don't. I mean, thousands of people do use it. Like Identica has a ton of users, and StatusNet is a whole company. So like, there are people, just not in our bubble of the people we talk about. So definitely. And I think Win specifically was like, yo, this guy's my friend, you should talk to him because we talked about this thing in this talk. So yeah, we should talk about it later.
Bueno, thank you, Steve.
Awesome, thanks.
No tenemos más tiempo, pero bueno, cualquier cosa lo pueden preguntar después.